Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for meeting with us today. We're really excited about this opportunity. We think Larry's Laminate is a great company. There's a lot of opportunity here in this proposed sale. So introduction, the agenda quickly. So we'll go over introductions for the team, some deals that we've done in the past that we think are relevant to your situation here. We'll look at the situation, the company, the industry, and key players in the proposed transactions as we've discussed. And then we'll look at the valuation and options and how we think we should go forward with that. So quickly, the team here. So Brady, Elizabeth, Sean, Hank, and myself. We have over 50 years of combined investment banking experience and also some industry-specific experience that we think lends well to the proposed sale and how we're going to navigate it. So we'll go over the history of Star Capital. So why Star Capital? We're headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, not far from your headquarters in Chicago. So that's nice, Midwest. We have a middle market focus with expertise that I mentioned in the materials sector. And that's demonstrated by our selected deals from the past 5+ years. One that I'd like to highlight is our 2019 sell-side advisement between Clearwater and Armor Pano. They actually they manufacture melamine products. So we think that's a perfect fit for what you do. So we've navigated these waters before. And with that, I'll go into a quick overview of Larry's and then the industry. So as you can see, Larry's competes very well amongst its peers with the 2-year revenue CAGR of 5.8% and then the 12-month trailing EBITDA margins of 19.8%. And we see those only getting stronger in the coming years with the projections going out 23, 24 on the screen. In terms of industry growth, we know that COVID has impacted it a little bit. We have 1.1% industry growth. We think that petrochemical costs going down is actually a good thing because you'll be able to lock in the margins that you've been able to get through the pandemic. So we think that'll be very good for profitability. And then in terms of the construction and residential sectors, we know those are going to rebound with the markets opening up and demand for the products coming. So we think that'll lend well to your revenue growth. In terms of economic uncertainty, this isn't unique to Larry's, but we do think it's worth mentioning that there's still uncertainty in terms of where inflation will go and how the Federal Reserve will handle that with their rates, which could make borrowing a little bit more expensive, but we see that cooling now, which bodes well for us. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sean.
Thanks, Kyle. So just kind of to give a quick recap of what we see on the table. So Larry, we know that you own 70% and you want to retire in the next year to two, but you really want to preserve the legacy that you've created with Larry's Laminates and also take care of your employees. John and Sheila, we also know that you guys own 30% together and that you would like to roll over your equity into a new company or, if you can, even buy out the company outright. However, we believe that working with Stepstone or another private equity firm is the best bet to solve all of the goals of everyone here. And we'll get into that just a little bit more later. And they are also interested in the management team rolling over their equity into the new company. However, as it stands, Larry would have to also stay on for another year to two as an advisor, but we believe through negotiations we can change that. And so the management team, just to recap, has $50 million in capital that they've raised, but we do believe, again, that working with private equity is the way to go.
So straight out, we believe the fair value of your equity is $84 to $96 million, based on the information that you've provided us. We used 4 valuation methods: public comps, recent private transaction comps, DCF and LBO. I'll go over the market-based valuations, and then I'll hand it to Brady for the intrinsic.
Before you jump in, just to clarify, equity value or enterprise value?
Equity value.
So you're not including the $22 million in debt in
No.
94 to 96?
No.
Correct. So enterprise would be 118 at the top end?
Yeah. So for the public comps, we filtered by a set of companies that had similar products, indoor finishings, and on average, a similar gross margin profile. For that group of companies, the EBITDA range was 8 to 9.5 times. For transaction comps, we filtered for enterprise value to revenue, enterprise value to EBITDA, and implied margin to find the similar transaction comps, and that EBITDA range was 9 to 10 times.
So out of curiosity, why are you using enterprise value for your precedents and equity value for your analysis of us?
To determine, so in terms of, we want to show you the equity value because that ultimately is what you're going to get paid.
So the precedents would then in theory be lower because they're including their debt.
Yes, but we use the ratios of those to make sure that they were comparable. But we wanted to show you the equity because it's what's applicable to you and what's going to, especially for Larry, the cash that's going to go into his pocket.
So let's do some quick math then on the transaction comps. Adjusting this for the 20 million in debt, you're at $110 million enterprise value, correct?
Yes.
I've got about 10 million in EBITDA, just to keep the numbers simple. So
Yep.
I'm an 11 times deal, apples to apples. So I've got a market that's at 9 times. And you're saying I'm worth 11 times?
The EBITDA was 11.2 2022. So that's where we're getting that.
I think another thing that we could consider is that the public comps are pricing in a lot of the economic uncertainty, whereas the transaction comps, I think the most recent one was July of 2021, 2022.
June of 2022.
June of 2022, thank you. So really, I don't think that the transaction comps were pricing in a lot of the uncertainty with the basis point raisings of the Fed.
But at the same time, I think given, and Brady will talk to this, and the intrinsic valuations, we still think the transaction comps are more valuable to your scenario because of the cash flow and the EBITDA margins that you guys have.
Yeah, it's a good jumping off point.
Right, but then how do you factor in for the size and scale of our business versus the transaction comps, which are 6 times larger on average?
That's why we did percentage and ratio of enterprise value to the revenue and enterprise value to the EBITDA.
Yeah. Another thing to consider, even though the scale of those transaction comps are different, really the margins and maybe the growth profile are in line with Larry's laminates. And so qualitatively, they're checking at least 2 of the 3 boxes.
Agreed, if you can scale the business to 100 million in EBITDA at the same margins.
So I'll jump into the DCF that we did. I think the intrinsic valuation of Larry's laminates is a great demonstration of the strong cash flows that you guys are generating in your operations. So we took the multiples from the transaction comps, and then we took your revenue projections. I think it was about 1% in year 1, and then we held the 6.43% growth constant moving forward. And I think the reason you see that the enterprise value and the equity values are both higher than the transaction comps are because relative to your peers, you're an above average growth company with great margins. Under the LBO as well, so it's the same with the DCF. Because you guys generate so much cash, the cash sweep available for debt reduction is high. So a financial buyer is capable of paying you guys a relatively higher multiple relative to public comps. So we think that, yeah, as Sean iterated, I think Hank reiterated, engaging with a financial buyer, Stepstone is a great example. It's the best way to maximize your value as well as meet the needs of all the stakeholders.
So looking broadly strategic options, we briefly considered status quo and a strategic buyer, but given the pros and the cons, they did not meet the requirements that you guys had to close for a deal. So didn't consider those. In terms of kind of the qualitative aspects, the management buyout meets it. However, as Sean mentioned, the capital availability is just not there. So therefore, we think working with the private equity buyer is the best choice for you. The only slight downside would be that Larry has to stay on as an advisor for 1 to 2 years given Stepstone's current offer. However, we think we can negotiate that.
Now that we've had a little bit of a chance to talk about some of the pros and cons of the various strategic alternatives, let's talk a little bit more specifically about some deal terms that we would propose negotiating with Stepstone on. So first, we would counter Stepstone at 10 times EBITDA, which is 2 to 3 turns higher than the outstanding verbal offer that they've already given of 7 to 8 times EBITDA. In terms of achieving In terms of achieving goals, we understand, Larry, that you really would like to see retirement within the next year, and the current offer, or current verbal offer from StepStone would require you to stay on in an advisory role for 1 to 2 years. Clearly, that does not meet your objective, and we feel that we have a strong case to counter that with instead keeping John and Sheila both in the business. Really, they are the heart of the operations currently. We understand Larry has not had an active role in the operations since 2015, and so John and Sheila are the ones who really know the business inside and out on an operation level, and you are still eager to remain with the company, rolled into whatever comes next. And so we feel that is, we have a very strong argument to be able to counter that point. And also, StepStone has already indicated that they would love to see, substantial, if not all, of the equity rolled into the new deal. And so John and Sheila, we've operated under the assumption that you would roll all 30% of your combined equity into a new company. In terms of preserving legacy, we understand that you care a whole lot about your employees and about the legacy of your company. You spend a considerable amount of money during the COVID-19 pandemic to protect the well-being and the health of your employees. And so we would negotiate with StepStone to make sure that all of your employees outside of management, their employment contracts stay intact, so they feel secure moving into the next phase of the business as well. As I already mentioned, retaining those management roles for John and Sheila so you can stay engaged. We also understand that you think you have the tools under your belt to be able to double the business within the next 5 to 7 years, and so that's a win-win for everybody. And so keeping you guys on is ideal for everyone. It also gives you some time to succession plan after that second bite of the apple in 5 to 7 years, and also be able to optimize governance in any sort of deal structure.
I've got a question on that.
Yeah.
Have you worked with StepStone before?
Not with StepStone directly, but we do a lot of deals in the material space, centered around, we've done buy side and sell side with private equity before. We know StepStone's a reputable group with a ton of assets under their control, and I think they're a great growth partner for Larry's Laminates.
So how confident are you that you'll be able to get them to agree to a 10 times deal with their, currently at 7 to 8?
Yeah, I think
Understanding StepStone's target IRR, or target returns of 20 to 25% in our models, they clear that 20% with no issues, and so that still meets their financial objectives. And so countering with that 10 times EBITDA, they can afford to pay that. So
I think it's a reason.
How are you planning on putting 5 times leverage on this business out of the gate? I know in the case it says 4.25, but it looks like you're rolling the existing debt based on the LBO analysis. You're at almost 70 million in debt.
So the LBO analysis, the one we have in the appendices is wrong. We have an updated one that we can send you that we did on a debt-free basis where the debt does not roll over. In that scenario, so we remove the existing debt and then we combine the equity of StepStone or a private equity partner and John and Sheila, and at the high end of our fair value range, they achieve a 20% IRR.
yes, and the reason why we combined the rolled equity with the new equity that would be put in by the PE firm or StepStone is because if you parcel it out, John and Sheila, your returns are under 10%, which is not optimal, and StepStone's are much higher than that. So by combining the equity and calculating those returns at the end, and then being able to apply that to selling the business after that second bite of the apple, that ensures that StepStone is still getting their target IRR, they're still remaining within their target IRR range, but that also gets to up John and Sheila your returns as well, because of all the hard work that you are putting into the transition and propelling the new company forward.
So what's my man Larry getting paid?
Sean, if you can drop back to the football field. A 70% equity stake at our fair value range, Larry, you're going to clear anywhere from 58 to 66 million when we do an LBO with StepStone or a different private equity firm. And John and Sheila, frankly, I think because you guys are so integral to the business, you two have leverage to make some demands in the deal that we make moving forward that Elizabeth alluded to there.
Have you considered a process that involves more than just Stepstone?
We have considered a limited auction process, so if we could go back to the next steps. What we see, I'll let Elizabeth take this, but in general, we see a limited auction process that will keep us within that 1-year timeline, but I'll hand it off to Elizabeth.
Yep, so our ultimate recommendation right now and the next steps that we analyzed are with a negotiated sale process just with Stepstone. However, if after some negotiations, it's clear that we cannot reach common ground with Stepstone on those negotiations to meet, both financial targets and also those additional deal terms that are integral to, your personal objectives. That should be pretty clear by the end of the second stage, so within 2 to 3 weeks. And at that point, it would be relatively easy to pivot to a limited auction process. And realistically, that should only tack on maybe 1 to 2, maybe 3 months to the entire timeline, which clears that 1-year goal for Larry to be able to retire with no issues. So just to kind of talk you through that negotiated sale process steps, immediately we would counter Stepstone at 10 times EBITDA with those additional deal terms that we've already talked about. We also would exchange non-disclosure agreements at this stage just to protect the confidentiality of both parties moving into this. It's for discretionary reasons and to minimize the disturbance that happens to your operations while all of this is taking place. Reasoning for that and beginning negotiations. The second stage is engagement, so 2 to 3 weeks. In this portion of the process, securing a letter of intent with due diligence and exclusivity period terms. Of course, also a purchase price, which is what I alluded to, where if that's not a number that we can agree with on Stepstone, at that point, then we'll know if we need to pivot to a limited auction process or a targeted auction process. And also just the threat of introducing more competition to the process might be enough to, light a little bit of a fire under Stepstone to get them to meet our demands. And yeah. And then you'd also start preparing a data room so that Stepstone could begin due diligence in the next stage, and then any additional continued negotiations would happen at this point. The third stage is due diligence, so approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Facilitating data room access and responding to any due diligence requests from Stepstone. At this point, you would also provide a third-party quality of earnings report. Again, any continued negotiations that still need to happen at this point, complete any outstanding financing contingencies, and this is where you'd start working with each party's respective legal teams to finalize or to draft a purchase agreement and any other sort of employment contracts or other legal documents that would need to take place for the transaction to close. And finally, the fun part is closing the deal, which should hopefully take around 2 to 3 weeks. This is where due diligence will wrap up, complete any final negotiations, and enter into the purchase agreement. And ultimately, we close the deal and announce whether it's just to your respective companies or if you want to announce that to the public, however you want to handle that. That's the fun part.
So I have a question for you. I'm Larry. When I went to the country club recently, one of the guys I was golfing with talked about selling his company, and he talked about a pool of equity that the private equity company set aside for future employees that were going to come in. Would there be any way that a deal could be structured where part of that pool could be used to compensate our existing employees as well?
Absolutely, that's certainly something that could be negotiated moving forward. And there's still a lot of room for creativity that we could sit down and talk about before we start, before we send off any sort of counter offer to Stepstone, which if some sort of equity earnout, or we understand John and Sheila in the proposed management buyout scenario that you had $5 million of your own additional capital that you're willing to put into a management buyout scenario. If that money is still on the table that you would want to put into a new company with Stepstone, that's certainly something that can be, we can run the models and the numbers on that as well to see if that's feasible. And
the offer also at the 10 times EBITDA hitting the higher end of the fair value range is also including, as we said, the combined equity of John and Sheila and the PE firm. If we wanted to make more room for your employees, there's definitely room for that, even go slightly higher. So yes.
Just to be clear, so you're assuming that John and Sheila will roll 100% and not receive any liquidity with the upfront transaction?
Correct.
That is our assumptions, yes.
They'll need to pay taxes though, right?
By
Yes.
Is there an accountant in the room?
Sheila, our
None of this,
understanding
yeah.
is that you work for, wherever Sheila is, our understanding is that you worked for a Big Four accounting firm before this, so you had any rebuttal to that?
Good job, team. That's time.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.